What's up, YouTube? Today we're going to talk about how to make assets in Photoshop for game dev. What you can see here is a final look at the types of things that we're going to be creating. Here we have a tile sheet, and then we have walls with collision, and we have a character that is animated with an idle animation and some run animations. All right, let's get into it. So we'll open up Photoshop. Let's talk a bit about canvas creation. So whenever you create a new file, you're going to have a couple of things to consider. One being the canvas size, two being background contents, and three being resolution, and I suppose to some extent orientation. Typically I go with something kind of square. The important thing when thinking about your canvas size is that whatever you create on there will of course be limited in size maximally, but also you want to think about what kind of game object it is that you're creating. If for instance I have a player and it can fit within a 250 by 250 pixel box, then I probably don't want to make an enemy that is, say, 20 pixels by 20 pixels because it'll just be way too small and I'll have to stretch it once the game actually implements, and then the art will look really bad. Another thing to consider is background contents. I recommend in most cases setting your background to transparent. If you were to set your background to white, black, or some other color, whenever you go to export, you're going to have basically a background, and so whenever you have your character running around in your game, there will just be a square of your canvas behind them, and that doesn't look very good. Usually do a transparent background, and then whatever you create, you can always make it fill the entire canvas. So that's always an option. We'll go ahead and create this right here. The first thing we're going to talk a bit about is layers. For this example, I've decided to create a 250 by 250 pixel canvas. My player will be about that size, as well as the tiles for the background that we're going to put in as well. So we're going to talk about layers. Layers are a great way to do your work in an organized and non-destructive fashion. I'll show you right now an example of this. Say I was drawing a person and we have their smiling face, and say that I'm drawing his body and I get really far into my art process and now he's super detailed and really good, but I notice I made a mistake a long time ago and I made this little yellow outline. I could go back through and try to erase it or scribble over it, but something better is if you work with layers regularly, what you could do is create each piece of your character or each coloring layer or lighting layer. You can just split your work into a more organized way so that you only edit what you want to edit and not the entire drawing all at once. So for instance, let's say that I wanted to color in our character yellow, and I just scribble over it like this. And then I'll drag this layer on top because the coloring should be below it. And then later on I decide, oh wow, this coloring looks awful. Well, what I can do is I can completely get rid of that layer if I want, or I could go back in and edit only this coloring and say I color it in completely or change it in some other way. The options are really endless and up to your creativity with layers, but the idea is that the thing that you're editing is only what's on that layer, and it makes it so that mistakes aren't an issue or are easier to fix in the future. So something that's very common with that is something like shading. Say that I wanted to make the character look more 3D. I have like darkness. Say that there's light coming from this direction. You could of course like shade the character down here, and then you could have a new layer for lighting that would make lighter yellow or up here. And this obviously looks really bad, but you could go back and now change your dark layer or your light layer, and you can rename these however you want. And then of course you have your character outline layer. So say you didn't like the thick outlines. If you went through and colored your entire character, eventually what you would have is like a very painterly look. Something also to note is it's a really good idea to name your layers something that makes sense so that whenever you're actually editing, you know what you're looking at. So this could be like the line art layer. This might be the highlights. This might be the lowlights. Something that's important to note is that this is kind of a two-edged sword. You might be doing your art and then decide, oh, I also need to change my low lights, switch your color to your low lights, and then start editing over here because say you wanted the shadow darker. And then you realize, oh no, I've been working in my highlights layer for the last half an hour. So it's really important to look and see which layer it is that you're actually doing your work on. Otherwise you might destroy your whole structure, but it's still a very valuable tool that's worth using. This is also how you can make your character poses much easier. For instance, what I did is I created a bunch of different layers, one for like say your arm, one for arm 2, and so on and so forth, until I was able to basically take this character apart and then move them like a doll to create my animations. Something else that can help set these layers apart and prevent bad changes from happening is layer effects. So right here you can see that this says normal, but there are a whole bunch of different options that you can choose that change the entire way that this works. So darken is actually a layer for doing these low lights, and it will only really darken what you have there. Something like multiply is a good one. It also works towards darkening. Basically, these are all the darkening type of effects. These are all the lightning type of effects. So this can help with highlights. And you can see, since we made that mistake and drew in the dark part, we're actually lightening up the area down there in the bottom of the face with these layers. Overlay is like a good one for texturizing a lot of times. You can add like an image and then overlay it on yours, and that can help you with something like texture. Feel free to play around with these and know that each layer can have its own effects. You can also do something called a clipping mask. And so if we were to do a clipping mask on our color, now both of these can only affect areas that we've actually colored. So you see how whenever we turn these into clipping masks, a lot of the shading went away. Well, that's because we never colored this area down here. So only places that have been colored in can affect that. That's another very useful tool. So you can only affect lines that are on your clipping mask. So now we're going to get into tile maps, which is a static element that you use in your video games. This would essentially be the background that you saw earlier right here, and that includes walls, that can include floor. Eventually that can include things like bushes, trees, tables, anything that you want to put in your game. You can include collision. It makes for an easy and replicable way to place objects in your video game. For this one, I didn't do a transparent background because I knew I was going to fill every single frame completely, or every single layer completely. And so whenever I export, this background doesn't particularly matter. So let's talk a little bit about what you'd need whenever you're creating something like a tile map for your floors. So here's the floor tile map for the game that you just saw. There are only a couple pieces that you need to be able to paint and create any kind of pattern that you would want. That includes a inner corner, an outer corner, a side piece, and then your full filler pieces. Here is the outer corner. I'm calling this one basically the default. So that would be the outer corner. This would be the inner corner. This would be the side piece. And you can imagine this is like a bush and this is dirt if you want. In this case, we're kind of doing like a spaceship kind of theme. So these are more inside of a spaceship or kind of like an office building type thing. So here would be our filler. So it's all this one pattern. And then here's this one pattern. And so you can use that to convert between the two. And then I was creating some walls. The walls don't really have transition pieces like that. The thing to care about is that you can have back walls, side walls, and the close walls. And then of course just empty space so that whenever we're in game, you can see like based on the camera's perspective, this back wall should be more visible than the side wall, which should be more visible than the front wall. And something I missed on the corner piece is to draw a little bit of line there. But the things that you need then are a bottom corner, which you're going to be able to flip horizontally to get the other corner, and then an upper corner to, of course, match the back wall with the side wall. So these are just pieces that we need to connect. And with those assets, you'll be able to create every single thing that you'll need in your game. And then you can, of course, choose to add other sorts of decorations or anything like that. Now we've talked a little bit about a tile map. Let's talk about how to get this into a usable state for our video game. And that would be by creating a tile atlas. We'll go through the one for the floor. For the floor, I have 6 different pieces. These are all 250 by 250 pixels. And so what I'm going to do is I'll create a 3 by 2x2 grid and use that to store every single piece. And then whenever you bring it into your game engine, you'll be able to, of course, select each piece individually and then paint it around. What we do is we create a new canvas. Now, instead of 250 by 250, it would be, 250 times 3. So that'd be 750 times 250 times 2. So that's 500. I already have this made. So we'll go ahead and open our tile atlas. And here we are. We would just copy paste all of those in. And then we can transform each of them to their position in the tile atlas. And then what we want to do is go to export. Export as PNG. And then you can put that directly into your game project folder. And see, I've already done that. It's already in the game. Something that can help you align these is the grid. So you can go to View, Show, Grid. And now you can see I have a grid that helps me align these things. If you go to View, Snap to Grid, then that will additionally help you align these things, because whenever you're dragging them around, it will snap to them. And then you can go to Edit, Preferences, and Guides, Grids, and Slices. And then here you can control the actual grid size if your grid isn't the size that you want. So we have 250 by 250 as our canvas size, and I want a subdivision in there so that I can see where the center of each frame is. That's what these little dotted lines here are. And then of course we have the major lines here that should be containing each frame, or in this case, each tile. So yeah, that's how you can align these things a little bit better. In order to copy paste across files, you can just highlight all the ones that you need and then Control C. And then once you get into your new file, it's as simple as Control V. In order to move things around, you can select your rectangular marquee tool or any of the lasso type tools, and then you'll go to free transform, and then you're going to be able to drag these things around. And as you can see, with the grid setup the way it is, it just snaps right into place, and then you can say done, and you can click through and do that for every single layer, and that's how you can create your tile atlas. So what I've shown you so far is what to do for static things like a tile map or any kind of other static asset in your game. But what if you want to create an animation for your game? To do that in Photoshop, we use something called the timeline. So you can open the timeline by going to Window, Timeline, and just checking that box, and I'll drag this up so that we can see it a little bit better. The timeline comes with a couple of options, so now I'm going to show you how to use it. There are two options here. There's frame animation and video timeline. Frame animation is simpler but comes with less features, and I recommend using the video timeline. It's just a more robust tool, and it has features that are important when it comes to animating. We can go ahead and create a new timeline, and I always start off by dragging this a lot shorter. And you can use this mountain tool right here to zoom in. And yeah, now we'll go through setting up a couple of the key features. Here, this little cog wheel has something called loop playback. If you're trying to animate something like a run cycle, you would want this clicked. If you're trying to animate something like a punch that should only play one time, you might not want that to be clicked because you just want it to play through once. You probably want to check it anyway whenever you're drawing the animation, because it'll just play on repeat, and that makes it easier to watch and see if there's anything wrong with it. Next setting to look at would be your frame options. So if we go to panel options here by clicking this little hamburger menu, you can see that the timeline can either come with time code or frame number units. The simplest to work with for game dev is frame number, since that's what we'll be using in our game engine. If you were creating like a standalone animation, it could be good to use a time code. For instance, if you were creating a standalone animation for something like Instagram or like a YouTube animation. But for games, we want to use frame number in general. So what that'll do is it'll transform the units up here to frame numbers. Mine was already set up that way, so that's what it looks like. What we have right now is our layer 1 playing for 16 frames. Our layer 1 is empty, so nothing happens when we click play. Next setting to talk about would be the frame rate. In your game, you might want to think about the speed at which you'd want these animations to play. This doesn't necessarily have to be the frame rate that you're targeting users to play at. This is just the frame rate that the animation will play at. And often people will animate on 1s, 2s, and 3s. And what that means is that a frame may be held for more than one frame of the game. Something else we can talk about is onion skin settings. So for that, I'll open my flagship guy. This is an animation that I already had completed. This is what it looks like. Something that onion skinning does is that it allows you to see the frames that you are not working on. And you can open onion skin settings to see how many frames before or how many frames after, and then how visible or not visible those are. So if I was to change this to something like 80, you can see that this is now much more visible than whenever it was at opacity 50, and likewise I could lower it to something like 20, and now it's very difficult to see. So that's very nice to help yourself as you're animating forward. You can say, okay, this is where my character was before. Now I need to make my next frame, you know, this leg needs to move slightly further up, or this arm needs to move slightly further up, and so on and so forth as you create your pose. So that's just a very useful tool to use while you're doing the drawing. And something else important to note is your work area. That would be this little thing right here. If you're trying to focus on just a small aspect of your animation, say for instance this second step, you can just close that work area in a little bit and it'll just play that small bit of animation. Or if you have multiple animations and you only want to see one at a time, you can do that by turning this off, or you could do that by just setting them in different spots and changing the work area. So you can see that he is in his idle animation, and then if I were to move it over here, it would play the run and the idle, which is not very useful, but something you can do. Another setting that's important to know is this show video groups only. So I have these video groups for running and for idle. I have other resources that I used whenever I was creating these animations. For instance, I chopped up my character so that I could put each piece into a pose and then connect them together with art. It made it way faster to animate these poses. But if I don't want to see these on my timeline, you can just go to show video groups only, and now all of those are gone, and I can just look at my actual animations. So that would be everything that you need to know about the timeline in Photoshop. Other than that, it's up to your individual art skills in order to create each frame. But I can tell you a couple of techniques or strategies that will help you build these frames. Whenever you're building these frames, you can find something like a pose guide online that can help you kind of control your puppet and make something that looks at least reasonable, and it can help you with animation ideas such as squash and stretch and things like that without really needing to be an expert on it. You can copy paste the last frame, and that is something really helpful, especially when you're using your onion skinning. Is say I am getting ready to do the next frame, my character is in this pose. For the next frame, I know I want him to be in this pose. I can just copy this frame and then kind of use the lasso tool to move each of these limbs into the pose that I want. Alternatively, you can do what I did, which is chop up the body, and then you have each piece of your character that you can move into a specific pose, and you can copy paste all of these before merging them together, and then you'll have a created character for the frame in the pose that you want. Something important whenever you're animating to think about proofreading your work is to go back and watch your animation a bunch of times, but looking at one thing individually for a couple of playthroughs. So for instance, if I wanted to look at this front leg and make sure that it wasn't taking any kind of weird path, or if I wanted to look at the back arm, or I wanted to make sure that the character was bobbing the way that I wanted them to, or that they weren't shaking back and forth in some kind of crazy way, it's important to watch through your animation many times, and you can edit these things individually rather than just trying to draw the whole thing perfect straight on. Now you have your final animation. Let's talk about making a sprite sheet. That's very similar to what we did earlier with the tile map, except for there's going to be one additional component, and that would be how you orient your character in the frame. Since our tile map took up the entire frame, we didn't have to worry about where we were placing our tile because it just took up the whole frame. We have a character that's running and they don't take up the entire frame. Something important to note is that we use these grids and guidelines in order to orient the player so that once we're in our game engine, the player is not stuttering back and forth every single frame because we didn't pay attention to where we were placing them. This is something that's very hard to change in the game engine and very easy to change right now. So it's important that we turn on our snapping, and it's important that we set up our character in the most optimal way possible. Once you bring your character into your game engine, you're going to be able to split the sprite sheet into a bunch of individual frames, and that's what this grid setup we have here is showing us. These major lines are going to be where those splits happen, and then these little dotted lines are going to be the center of each of those frames. So we can use that to help orient our player and make sure that there's not going to be any issues once they've been put into the game. Whenever we're creating our sprite sheet canvas, what we want to do is we want to take our longest animation and multiply our canvas width by the number of frames of that longest animation, and then we want to take the number of animations and multiply our height by that. So what you can see here is we have our run cycle, and that's 10 frames long, and we have our idle cycle, and that's 5 frames long. And so we have a 10 frame by 2 frame canvas. Our canvas was 250 by 250, so that would be 2500 by 500. So now we have our finished sprite sheet. What we can do is hit our file, export as PNG, and you can export that directly into your game folder, just as I have already done right here. In our next video, we'll get into Godot and how you can actually make use of these artifacts that we've just created. Thanks for watching that video. I hope that you learned something new. If you liked it or would like to see more, make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe. I really appreciate your time. I hope you have a great day.